The year was 1865, and the frontier was a land of both opportunity and death. Dust clung to the wind like a restless spirit, curling in golden swirls beneath the dying sun. The outpost stood as a lone promise of trade and respite, a wooden skeleton of a town built on blood bargains and the whisper of coins. Eliza Monroe pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the warmth of the desert still lingered in the air. 17 years old, alone, and keenly aware of the weight of men's gazes, she moved carefully through the trading post, keeping to the edge of the crowd. Her fingers traced the worn surface of the locket at her throat, her only possession of worth. She had no illusions about the world. Orphaned by fever, sold as a servant, and now barely scraping by in a place where women were worth little more than the price of a night's comfort, she had learned quickly to read people. And right now, she read danger. The tension in the air was thick, carried on the clipped murmurs of traders and the heavy presence of the soldiers standing at the edge of the post, hands never far from their pistols. Something was brewing. Men exchanged glances, subtle nods. A few Navajo riders stood apart, their dark eyes unreadable as they bartered furs for weapons and supplies. Among them was a man Eliza had seen before, Chief Takota. He was taller than the others, broad-shouldered with a quiet intensity, his black hair braided with leather cords. Unlike the others, he did not engage in the haggling, merely observing, as though waiting for something unseen. Eliza watched him warily. He had been coming to this outpost for weeks, always silent, always distant. There were rumors, of course. Some said he had lost his family to raiders, that he carried ghosts in his shadow. Others whispered that he was no longer a chief, but a warrior with nothing left to protect. But no one dared to question him outright. Something in his presence warned against it. The hush in the post deepened as a group of new riders entered. Bounty hunters, their coats thick with dust, their rifles slung low. Their leader, a lean man with a snake smile, dismounted, dusting off his sleeves before stepping forward. The soldiers straightened, their gazes flicking toward the Navajo traders. Eliza felt her pulse quicken. "I hear there's a reward out for certain savages causing trouble in these parts," the bounty hunter drawled, his voice like rusted iron. "Word is, there's a whole camp of 'em just a few miles from here." The Navajo men stiffened. Takota did not move. The bounty hunter's eyes swept the crowd and landed on Eliza. He took his time, looking her over like one might inspect a horse. "And I reckon there are plenty of folks around here who'd sell a bit of information for the right price." Eliza held his gaze, refusing to shrink. She had seen his type before. Men who took what they wanted, men who assumed fear meant weakness. "You won't find anything here," she said evenly. The bounty hunter's smile widened. "That's so? Well, we'll just have to see about that." Without warning, he turned and fired a shot into the air. The crack of the gun sent a ripple of panic through the trading post. Horses neighed, men cursed, and in the chaos, the soldiers moved. Eliza saw it before it happened, the shift in their stance, the unspoken agreement. This wasn't a warning. It was an execution. Gunfire erupted, shattering the stillness. The Navajo traders reached for their weapons, but they were outnumbered, caught in the open. Two fell immediately. Takota moved fast, knocking over a trader's stall for cover, but the soldiers advanced. Eliza didn't think. She acted. Grabbing a discarded rifle from the ground, she turned and fired. The shot was wild, but it was enough to create a moment of hesitation. Enough for Takota to lunge at one of the soldiers, taking him down with a swift, brutal movement. "Eliza, run!" someone shouted, but she was already moving. The post was in chaos. Men trampling over each other, trying to flee as bullets cut through the night. Takota's voice reached her through the madness. "This way!" She followed without hesitation, weaving through the alleys between the buildings. Behind them, the soldiers were regrouping. More shots rang out. A splinter would exploded near her shoulder as a bullet struck a post. They reached the edge of the outpost where horses were tied. Without waiting, Dakota untied one and swung onto its back. He reached down for her. Eliza hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then she took his hand. They rode into the night, the gunfire fading behind them, swallowed by the endless desert. The wilderness was an unforgiving thing. The moon bathed the land in silver light, casting shadows that stretched like specters across the sand. Eliza clung to Dakota as the horse galloped over uneven terrain, her heart pounding against her ribs. The reality of what she had done settled into her bones. She had fired on soldiers. She had helped a man they would call an enemy. She had made herself a fugitive. After what felt like hours, Dakota slowed their pace, guiding the horse toward a rocky outcrop that jutted from the desert floor like the ribs of some ancient beast. He dismounted in silence, scanning the horizon before turning to her. "Why did you help me?" His voice was low, measured. Eliza slid off the horse, her legs trembling beneath her. "Because they would have killed you." He studied her, his expression unreadable. "They will hunt you now, too." "I know." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Dakota nodded, as if accepting something unspoken. "We can't stay here," he said. "They will follow." Eliza swallowed, nodding. There was no turning back now. They moved into the shadows, two outcasts bound by fate, vanishing into the wild. The desert stretched endless before them, an ocean of dust and silence. The night had swallowed them whole, offering its cover. But as the first traces of dawn bled across the horizon, Eliza felt the weight of exhaustion settling into her bones. The chase had not ceased. Every rustling breeze carried the imagined crack of gunfire. Every shifting shadow threatened pursuit. Dakota led the horse through the maze of sandstone cliffs, his steps measured, his body tense. He had not spoken since they left the outpost, save for a brief warning when she stumbled. His presence was a wall, unwavering, unreadable. Eliza pulled her shawl tighter against the morning chill, her mind replaying the events of the previous night. The bodies, the blood, the moment she had lifted the rifle, taken aim, and fired. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, a strange numbness settled in, as if the girl she had been was already dissolving into dust. Dakota suddenly stopped, his hand raised in silent command. Eliza obeyed without question. He crouched low, pressing his palm against the earth, his gaze narrowing. "They are close." His voice was quiet but heavy. Eliza's breath hitched. "How can you tell?" Dakota pointed toward the ground. "Tracks. 5 riders. Maybe 6. They are moving fast." He stood, eyes scanning the terrain. "We must reach high ground before they trap us." The words carried a finality she did not question. They mounted the horse, pushing forward. The sun clawed its way over the horizon, baking the earth, turning the sand to fire beneath them. Eliza fought the urge to glance over her shoulder, to search for the silhouettes of their hunters. Hours passed in grinding silence. The land changed around them, cracked earth giving way to jagged canyons, narrow passes carved by time itself. The air grew heavy, the promise of rain hidden in the distance, though the ground remained bone-dry. The sudden rumble of thunder sent a tremor through the cliffs. Dakota pulled the horse to a stop. His eyes darted to the sky. "Eliza, we must move." She frowned. "It's just a storm." No, his gaze darkened. Not just a storm. Then she felt it, a shift in the air, a distant sound low and hungry, growing louder. Not thunder, water, a flood. Before she could process the thought, Dakota was moving. He pulled her onto the horse, heels digging into its sides as they raced forward. The ground trembled beneath them, the roar swelling into a monstrous bellow. They reached a narrow pass just as the wall of water came surging through the canyon behind them. Eliza gasped as she saw it. An avalanche of churning, brown fury, swallowing everything in its path. Dakota didn't slow. The horse leapt forward, hooves scrambling for purchase on the slick rock. Water licked at their heels. The canyon walls pressed in, leaving no room for error. Eliza clenched her fist in the horse's mane, her breath coming in short gasps. The noise was deafening, the water relentless. The passage narrowed ahead. A fallen tree bridged the gap between two cliffs, slim, unstable, but their only chance. Dakota made a decision. Eliza, hold tight. She barely had time to react before the horse lunged. The world tilted. For a heartbeat, they were weightless, suspended between survival and death. Then they crashed onto the other side, hooves scraping against solid ground. Eliza exhaled sharply. Behind them, the water devoured the canyon, the path they had taken vanishing beneath its rage. Dakota slid from the horse, eyes scanning the horizon. "They will not track us through that," he murmured. Eliza swallowed hard, her pulse still hammering. "That was close." Dakota turned to her, his gaze unreadable. "It is never not close." They found shelter in a small alcove carved into the rock. The silence that followed felt strange, too fragile, as if the world itself had held its breath. Eliza pulled off her shawl, rubbing at her arms. "Do you always live like this?" Dakota sat, stretching his legs before him. "Like what?" "Running, fighting, surviving." He considered her for a long moment. "It is not living. It is waiting." Eliza frowned. "For what?" "For the day the waiting ends." The words settled between them, heavy and unspoken. She shifted, hugging her knees to her chest. "I never thanked you." Dakota glanced at her. "For what?" "For saving me." Back at the outpost, he held her gaze, the firelight flickering in his dark eyes. "You saved yourself." The words unsettled her more than they should have. Before she could respond, a noise outside the alcove sent a chill through her spine. A footstep. Dakota was already moving. A knife materialized in his hand as he melted into the shadows. Eliza pressed herself against the rock, breath shallow. Another step. Closer this time. Dakota struck. A flash of steel. A choked gasp. Silence. Then a voice, low, amused. "Well now, that was rude." Eliza peeked out, heart hammering. A man stood just outside the firelight, one hand raised in surrender, the other resting casually on the pistol at his hip. He was older, with grizzled hair and a smirk carved into his sun-worn face. Dakota did not lower the knife. "You are alone?" he asked. The man chuckled. "If I wasn't, you'd already be dead." Eliza swallowed. "Who are you?" The stranger tipped his hat. "Jed Cooper. And you, miss?" "Just got real lucky." Dakota did not move. "How so?" Jed leaned against the rock, casual despite the blade inches from his throat. "Because I ain't got a reason to sell you out. Yet." Eliza and Dakota exchanged a glance. Jed grinned. "Now, don't look so worried. I ain't with them bounty boys, and I sure as hell ain't with the soldiers." He adjusted his coat, revealing a well-worn rifle. "I just like to know what kind of folks are wandering through my desert." Dakota's grip did not ease. "Why should we trust you?" "You shouldn't." Eliza exhaled, rubbing at her temples. "Then why are you here?" Jed shrugged. "Because I got a proposition. A trade." Dakota's eyes narrowed. "We have nothing to trade." Jed's smirk deepened. "Oh, but you do." A tense silence stretched between them. Eliza felt the shift in the air. Jed wasn't just another traveler. He was a man who knew things. A man who could be their salvation, or their downfall. The fire crackled between them, casting long shadows against the stone. And the waiting began again. The desert air had lost its edge, thick with the weight of the coming dusk. Smoke curled from the remnants of their fire, twisting in the dying light. Eliza sat cross-legged, her back straight despite the exhaustion coiled deep in her limbs. Across from her, Dakota crouched, hands steady as he sharpened a blade against a whetstone. Every movement was deliberate, controlled. She envied that control. For days now, They had been moving west, slipping through the bones of the land like ghosts. The flood had bought them time, but not freedom. The bounty hunters would return, and when they did, there would be no more warnings. Jed Cooper had stayed long enough to offer them half-truths and riddles, leaving before dawn with nothing more than a wry grin and a word of caution. "Trust no one," he had said. "Not even the ones you think you should." Eliza hadn't slept much since. The lessons began at first light. Dakota wasted no time, pressing her into training with a severity she had not expected. He did not coddle her, did not offer words of encouragement when she stumbled. He corrected her grip on the knife with measured precision, pushed her to strike again and again until her fingers ached from the effort. "Strength is not given," he told her after she missed her mark for the 5th time that morning. "It is taken." Eliza clenched her jaw, adjusted her stance, and tried again. Her progress was slow, but steady. By the 3rd day, she could hold her own against the wind. By the 5th, she could strike without hesitation. By the 7th, she no longer flinched at the thought of taking a life. It was on the 8th day that they found the first body. The man had been dead for hours, his face turned to the sun, eyes open and empty. His throat had been cut with precision, his hand still curled around the grip of his rifle. The sand beneath him was stained dark, the blood already dried beneath the heat. Dakota knelt beside the corpse, pressing his fingers against the cooling flesh. "They are close," he murmured. Eliza swallowed, gripping the knife at her belt. She did not ask who. She already knew. The bounty hunters had not given up. Dakota rose, scanning the horizon. "We move now." They traveled in silence, the weight of the dead man pressing against their heels. The terrain grew treacherous as the land sloped upward, jagged rocks biting at their soles. Eliza's muscles screamed in protest, but she did not complain. There was no space for weakness here. By nightfall, they had reached higher ground, a plateau overlooking the valley below. The sky stretched endless above them, scattered with stars. Dakota sat with his back against the rock, watching the landscape with the patience of a predator. Eliza settled beside him, pulling her knees to her chest. "Do you think they're still following?" Dakota did not look at her. "They never stopped." The word sent a shiver down her spine. She exhaled, resting her chin against her arms. "How do you know?" "Because I would." She turned to him then, studying the hard lines of his face, the quiet certainty in his eyes. "You were a chief," she said, though it wasn't a question. "I was." She hesitated. "What happened?" Dakota's gaze flicked toward the horizon. "What always happens." Eliza did not press further. Some wounds did not need words. She leaned back, closing her eyes against the wind. "We should rest," Dakota said. "Tomorrow will be harder." She did not doubt it. Dawn arrived with the promise of violence. They saw the riders just after sunrise, small figures in the distance, moving with purpose. 5 men. No more running. Dakota turned to her, expression unreadable. "It is time." Eliza felt her pulse quicken. She had trained for this. She had sharpened her body into something lean, something capable. But readiness was not the same as certainty. Dakota seemed to sense her hesitation. "You have the will to survive," he said. "Now you must prove it." There was no more time for words. They moved swiftly, weaving through the rocky terrain, keeping to the shadows. The plan was simple: divide, weaken, eliminate. Dakota took the first man in silence, a knife to the throat, quick and clean. He did not hesitate, did not waver. Eliza forced herself not to look away. The second man was hers. She crouched low behind the boulder, fingers curling around the handle of the knife. The bounty hunter was close now, oblivious to the danger lurking in the dark. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She waited. Then she struck. The blade found its mark, sliding between ribs. His breath hitched, eyes wide with shock. Blood warmed her hands. He fell. Eliza stumbled back, gasping for air. Dakota was beside her in an instant, pressing his fingers to her wrist. Breathe. She nodded, forcing herself to steady. There were 3 more. Gunfire cracked through the air. The fight had begun. Eliza and Dakota moved as one, striking swift and merciless. Another body fell, then another. Then it was over. The silence that followed was deafening. Eliza stood in the aftermath, breath ragged, heart pounding. Blood stained the earth. The bodies lay still. Dakota wiped his blade clean. You did well. She did not respond. She did not need to. The girl she had been was gone. Only the warrior remained. The wind howled across the open plain, carrying with it the scent of blood and dust. The bodies of the bounty hunters lay cooling in the dirt, their lifeless eyes staring at the sky as though it held the answers they would never receive. Eliza stood amidst them, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her hands slick with drying crimson. The weight of the knife in her grip was different now, no longer an instrument of survival, but of judgment. Dakota watched her from the shadows, his expression unreadable. He had seen warriors born in the fire of battle, had watched boys become men with blood on their hands. But she was not a boy. She was not Navajo. She was something else entirely, and yet he saw the steel in her spine, the silent reckoning behind her gaze. She did not flinch, did not recoil. The girl who had stumbled through the desert was gone. In her place stood something fierce, something unbreakable. He stepped forward, wiping his blade clean on the hem of a dead man's coat. They are dead, but there will be more. Eliza exhaled, steadying herself. Then we finished this. Dakota nodded once. There was only one left. The man who had put the price on his head, the one who had sent the hunters into the wild after them. The land baron who had claimed this stretch of the frontier as his own, who had fed on the fear of those weaker than him. They did not rest. The hours stretched thin as they followed the trail westward, their path carved through dry riverbeds and ghost towns abandoned to the sun. Eliza felt the change in herself with each passing mile, felt the weight of her past burn away with the heat of the land. There was no room left for fear, only the cold, unyielding purpose that drove her forward. By nightfall, they reached the edge of the valley. Below them, nestled against the river like a wound against flesh, sat the ranch, a sprawling beast of timber and iron, its windows glowing like the eyes of some slumbering predator. Men patrolled the perimeter, their rifles slung loose at their sides, their movements lazy. They did not expect trouble. Eliza crouched beside Dakota, scanning the layout. How many? At least 10, he murmured. More inside. She chewed the inside of her cheek. Then we'll have to be smart. Dakota studied her, something dark and knowing in his gaze. You do not hesitate anymore. She met his eyes without flinching. Hesitation is death. A ghost of a smile crossed his lips. He had spent his life among warriors, men who had fought and bled for things greater than themselves. But this girl, she had carved her own legend from nothing but fire and will. They moved like shadows, slipping through the darkness with the silence of predators. The first guard never saw them coming. Dakota's blade found his throat before he could utter a sound. Eliza followed suit, pressing her knife deep into the ribs of the second, feeling the life shudder out of him as she lowered his body to the ground. The night swallowed their sins whole. They reached the back entrance, the heavy oak door slightly ajar. Inside, voices murmured low, the sound of boots against floorboards. Dakota signaled to her, and she nodded. No turning back now. Eliza stepped inside first, her pulse steady. The hallway stretched before her, lined with portraits of men long dead, men who had built their empires on the suffering of others. At the end of the hall, a door stood half open, candlelight spilling out into the corridor. She moved forward, Dakota close behind. Inside, the land baron sat at his desk, a tumbler of whiskey in one hand, a pistol resting casually against the wood beside him. He did not look up as they entered. I was wondering when you'd come, he said, his voice slow, measured. Eliza did not hesitate. She stepped forward, the knife still warm in her grip. "Then you know why we're here." The man chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Revenge? Justice?" He leaned back, finally looking at her. "Or just another game of survival?" She did not blink. "You put a price on his head." The land baron exhaled through his nose, setting the glass down with a quiet clink. "That I did." He glanced at Dakota, eyes sharp as cut stone. "And you're the one they call the ghost of the canyons." "I thought you'd be taller." Dakota remained silent, his presence a storm barely contained. The land baron sighed, rubbing his jaw. "I didn't send those men after you out of hatred, you know. Just business. The way of the West." Eliza's fingers curled tighter around the knife. "Business?" He nodded. "People like you, like him. You don't belong in the future we're building. This land isn't meant for ghosts. It's meant for men with steel in their pockets. Men who understand that power isn't given. It's taken." Eliza felt something dark and hot coil in her chest. "You sound just like the men who sold me." For the first time, the land baron hesitated. "Sold you?" She tilted her head. "You didn't know?" A slow smile pulled at her lips, but there was no warmth in it. "I was bought and sold like cattle before I could walk. Passed from hand to hand like a chipped coin. I learned young what power meant." She took another step closer. "And I learned that the men who claim to own it never keep it for long." The land baron reached for his gun. Eliza was faster. The knife found its mark, burying deep into his chest. His breath hitched, his hand twitching uselessly before going slack. She watched as the life drained from his eyes, as the weight of his empire crumbled into nothing. Dakota stood beside her, silent as the grave. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain, the first drops pattering against the roof like distant drum beats. Eliza exhaled, the final vestiges of the girl she had been slipping away with the storm. She turned to Dakota. "It's over." He studied her, something unreadable in his gaze. Then, slowly, he nodded. But they both knew the truth. It was never over. Not in the West. Not for people like them. They stepped out into the night, the rain washing away the blood, washing away the past. Ahead of them, the horizon stretched wide and open, endless as the stories that would one day be told about the girl who became a warrior, and the man who walked beside her, forever a ghost in the land of the living.